So this is some work I'm doing with Joanna Mason at the University of Arizona. The title is what I'll be talking about, but more broadly, I'm going to be talking basically about how fitness has got some serious issues with how we model it, and I'm going to try to fix that in 12 minutes. So broadly speaking, the way that we treat fitness in mathematical models of evolution is can be divided into two categories. So in models where we care a lot about genetics, so population donor to be classic, we usually assign relative fitness values. So on the left-hand side there, you've got a mutant fitness, which is proportional to the wild-type fitness, and it's slightly greater by some selection coefficient S, which could be frequency dependent, but the key thing is that we just specify that value at the start. We say this is the fitness advantage of the mutant. And then we care about how frequencies change over time, so that's like the mutant sweeping. So at no point in this process do we care about ecology or traits or population density or anything like that. The other broad category is very much focused on traits. So that's what we'd call evolutionary ecology. And usually with these models, you specify essentially an ecological model that has traits in it. So the traits here are U and V. F and G would be the fitnesses. These are not absolute fitnesses. And then you'll study how those traits will evolve, when they're coupled to the population dynamics. So this is a classic sort of adaptive dynamics type trait evolution figure. The teardrop is sort of the region of stable coexistence, and the trajectories are how the traits are changing over time. So these are this sort of side of fitness modeling is very problem specific. So you just look at some particular, so in this case you're looking at like a mutualistic trait or something, and you have a very specific scenario in mind. They both have big disadvantages in that this is very abstract, whereas this is too specific. And so we're hoping to find a kind of a middle ground where you account for important things on population density, but you're not restricted to particular scenarios. So the first question obviously is that even possible, right? Like fitness is an extremely complex thing. It involves all these environmental variables, and in particular, every single functional trait affects fitness. That's the definition of a functional trait. For the most part, population geneticists have sort of given up in some respect. They said, that's a hopeless task, we'll just keep fitness as abstract. But ecologists have been looking at this problem for a long time, but they've been looking at it from a very different perspective. So this is an example of what's known as Grimes' triangle, and this is what's known as a trait classification scheme. So they took correlate traits, like I think they looked at 12 or 15 traits or something, and they did a hierarchical cluster analysis, and they find the different colors of the different clusters. They find that there's three very distinctive clusters, and these clusters correspond to what are known as like primary strategies. So the red cluster there is what's called a competitive strategy, so it grows very quickly, it shades out other corals. The blue cluster is a stress tolerator, so it grows more slowly, but it can deal with low light and low nutrient conditions. And then the weedy cluster has a very rapid turnover, but it's good at colonizing disturbed environments. So this is not just found in corals. This is just a good example because they did the statistics are solid. Graham, who's named after, originally looked at plants, and people have looked at all sorts of organisms. So the point here is that you've got this very high-dimensional space of traits, but there's three clusters in there, and so in some sense the degrees of variation in fitness is a lot lower than you would think from the complexity of traits and environments and so on. And in this case, it's actually just three key axes of variation that we need to care about. So this gives us some hope that it is possible to model fitness in general terms in a way that's not just an abstract constant. But in none of the ecology work have they really looked into that in much detail. So this was sort of the level of theory in Graham's work. So basically his idea was that each of those primary strategies correspond to like an environmental archetype. So he just distinguished between two main sources of environmental stressors. So, well, not really. Yeah, so there's two main environmental factors. So on the vertical axis you have stress, so that's like toxins or low light or low nutrients, and that can be high or low. And then you can have disturbance, which is like just physical destruction, herbivory, trampling, storms, whatever. That can be high or low. And when you both are low, those are ideal conditions, and that's when you have competitors doing well because things can just grow and they're forced to compete with each other. When disturbance is high, then you need the genotypes that can establish very quickly and have fast turnover times, and so on. And then the bottom half is kind of crossed out because high stress and high disturbance is fatal, and so you've got this sort of triangle. But that was sort of the level of it, so this is very verbal and descriptive. So we're trying to essentially make this rigorous mathematically. So the earliest work on density-dependent selection, which is probably the most famous as well, is McArthur's RK selection scheme. So this is just a brief recap, I'm sure you're familiar with this. So on the left figure there, you have R strategist and a K strategist. So those growth codes are then growing alone, they're not in competition with each other. So the R strategist grows quickly at first, but the K strategist can keep growing at higher densities. And you'll see on the figure at the right, if you do put them, if you grow them together, the R strategist will initially grow, will gain in frequency, and then eventually the K strategist takes over as the population density goes up. And obviously this is a lot more complicated than that simple sweeping that I showed you at the beginning, which population genetics looks at, which is what motivated McArthur to do this in the first place. So population density does matter. Unfortunately, the RK scheme is broken. So this is some data for protozoan species where they measured R and K in various ways, and rather than having a dichotomy between R and K where you're one or the other, they're actually correlated. And there's many studies that have found something similar to this. So I'll return to this just now when we go through my model. So we didn't try to start from that sort of RK setup. Instead, we decided to start from scratch and just try to get at Grimes triangle from the outset. So we used what's known as a site occupancy model. So basically that means that you break up a territory into little sites where each individual has their own site. So those are either really weird corals or trees, whatever. It's an individual niche. So the black and the white is the black and white are different genotypes, and it's a discrete time model. So each generation they send out propagules, and those will land on empty territories there, and then lottery competition happens. So essentially, lottery competition just means that each propagule that you send out is like a lottery ticket, and except that your lottery tickets have different chances of winning. So if you have a good competitor genotype, then your lottery tickets are better than other people's lottery tickets. But if someone else is sending it, it just has a whole bunch of lottery tickets that can still beat you. So that's shown here. The top figure shows that the white genotype is a better competitor. So at an individual level, its probability of winning the territory that it lands on is higher. And in fact, it's such a good competitor that it can beat the black genotype even if it got two propagules to land there. So this happens throughout, all of the unoccupied sites over the territory, and then there's a death step where old people die or a storm comes or whatever. So it's extrinsic death. It's not. It has nothing to do with competition, with the lottery stuff anyway. So that's the model. So there's three parameters that defines each genotype. Their fecundity, which is basically the number of propagules they send out per individual, their mortality, which is that death step, and then their competitive ability. So to return to this sort of conceptual setup, the way that we would view Grimes' three environmental extremes is that the ideal environment is low extrinsic mortality, which means that there's nothing keeping population density low, so you'd expect high population densities. The high disturbance regime is just high extrinsic mortality, and then the high stress regime is just that it's really hard to reproduce. So that's how we've represented that. So when we map those, when we assume those parameter values and we look at how the model I just described behaves in an invasion analysis, so you just look at what a mutant's fitness is at low density. So all I've done here is I've just drawn those axes again with the kind of primary strategies associated with zone as well. And you can see that there's the high density, there's two ways to be at low density, either expressible or disturbed. So when you look at the fitness in that model, that lottery model, at low density, it's just a simple growth rate, right? It's like the excess of burst over dense. And competition doesn't really matter because most of your propagules are landing on unoccupied sites, and so it doesn't matter what the other genotypes are doing. But at higher fitness, you have this lottery thing going on where you want lots of propagules, but you also want good competitive propagules. And so that means that you can be a good competitor either by having higher fecundity or higher competitiveness. And that's exactly consistent with that correlation between R and K that all these experiments have found. So in that sense, R is K-selected, and it makes perfect sense, given this very simple model. The other scenarios are when it's stress, when you're in a high stress environment, it's hard to increase your birth rates, so the only way to increase your fitness is to lower your mortality rates. You get these really slower life history, long generation time individuals. And similarly, in a high disturbance environment, there's nothing you can really do about the extrinsic mortality. That's what defines a high disturbance environment. And so you just have to try to maximize your fecundity. So I'll mention that usually when people try to think of Grom's triangle, they think of trade-offs, constraining things into a triangle. We haven't invoked any trade-offs here. This is just about the key axes that are pulling you in different directions. So this is independent of trade-offs or any assumptions about what the mutations are doing or anything. So that was just the invasion analysis of that model. I have actually solved that lottery model completely, so you can write out the complete density-dependent fitness function for it. It's not very complicated. It's not pretty enough that I want to write it down, but it can be doable. And so we can actually consider, we can take, we don't have to just look at invasion, we can look at what happens as a mutant sweeps. And so you can actually get coexistence in the model. So this is coexistence between a high competitor with a higher mortality and a sort of moderate competitor with moderate mortality. So in the coral example here, it's known that in competitive corals, the way they do it is they basically just grow very quickly, but that makes them sort of big and fragile, so when storms come along, they're more likely to die. Whereas the weedy types they grow more slowly, so they could get shaded out, but they're much more tolerant to storms. And so, so the reason that the coexistence occurs is because if you imagine that you're the competitive type growing, as you grow, the overall mortality rate of the population goes up because you've got a high mortality rate, so the population density goes down, and that means that competition becomes less important because now the amount of competition happening in each unoccupied site goes down, and so you sort of cancel out your own advantage and you get coexistence. So just summarize. So basically, I think Mercator's intentions were really good, but he didn't succeed in getting to what he wanted to get at it. Well, I think what he wanted to get at. So we kind of took a step back. We looked at, we started sort of on the empirical side at all of these trait classification schemes, and there are many of them, and they're quite impressive. It's worth looking at. Unfortunately, they're not mathematical, so essentially we tried to build the simplest mathematical model that would capture that. And the main thing that's missing in terms of like a broader model of fitness is K-selection. So that's our next step.